Our next reading comes from the book of Matthew, and it starts with chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon, and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last time the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last." This is the word of God.
Every time I pour myself into this parable, I am reminded of one of the early encounters I had with it a long time ago. I was asked to participate in a program at a hospital where I would do a religious component for alcoholics who were in the hospital who were detoxing. And I would do it for 1 hour a week for 6 weeks. And then at the end of my time, another pastor would do that. And then after a period of time, I'd be invited back to do the same thing. And I was just out of seminary, and they asked me to do this. And when you're out of seminary, you're cocky. You think you can do everything. Nobody has told you you can't do everything. And I was instructed by a friend of mine who got me connected to this, that all you need to do is just go up there and you let them set the agenda about religion. And you just talk about religion. And it could be a lot of fun. And so I go into my first session, and I discovered something. This was like 1978, and we had Muslims in the group, and I've never, ever in my life encountered a Muslim before. In 1978, there wasn't that many around. And there were some atheists in the group. I have encountered atheists. And there were some evangelical Christians in the group. And then there was some who just didn't know quite what. And so by 10 minutes into my conversation with them, we were in open war. And I'm sitting here going, oh my gosh, I just really stepped in it. Big time. And after the hour was over, I went to the director and I so apologized. And he said, well, let's don't give up yet. You come back next week. What is it you really like to talk about? And I said, well, I like parables a lot. He said, why don't you just come in and talk about parables? And so I did. I picked 3 parables, and this was the first parable that I chose. And I just simply said, we're going to talk about this parable. And I had printed it out, and everybody had a copy, and I read through it. And when I was in seminary, the dean of our seminary used to tell us, and I always thought this was the slickest thing, and he said, biblical study wasn't as difficult as people make it. He said, you just have to learn to ask 3 questions of the text, and keep asking those questions. And eventually, you'll figure it out. And the first question that you ask the text, when you read a text, what does this text tell us about God? And you hash that out. And you wrestle with that. And the second question you ask the text is, what does this text tell us about me, us, human beings? But if you really want to be personal, me. And you hash that over. And you hash it over until you sort of figure that out. And the third question you ask is, okay, what difference does all this make? What do I need to do to bring myself closer to God? And so I decided to apply that strategy to this parable. Now I remember when I first asked the question, what does this parable tell us about God? And a nice thing, and maybe the bad thing, I guess it's a judgment call, about people who are hit rock bottom, is that they are painfully honest and direct. And I can remember this person saying, well, this parable tells us that God is a, I'm going to let you put the adjective in, fool. Because nobody pays a guy the same amount of money for 1 hour work than 12 hours work. He's a fool. He paid those 1 hour and those 3 hour employees way, way too much. This God Jesus is talking about as a fool. So we talked a lot about that as a group. And I was really struck by that because, here you got a group of people that really have hit rock bottom and not the most successful people in the world. And have had all sorts of problems. And I would figure this group of people would sort of cheer on the guy who was so generous to the people who only worked an hour. But they didn't. They didn't cut him any slack at all. Which tells me how ingrained our values about money are. So then we went to the second question. What does this parable tell us about us? And I can remember we get what we earn. We deserve what we earn. We are entitled to what we earn. And again, I was so struck by the fact that here was some of these people were very poor, very sick, and yet telling that very strict lie that you don't get anything unless you've earned it. So then we wrestled with the last question, and I don't remember quite how all that came out, but I gotta tell you, the parables made it so much easier. And so that's what I did. I was the parable guy. Come in, throw some parables out, we chew them up, talk about them. And I avoided war every week just by using parables. And I think this is one of the reasons why Jesus tells parables, because Jesus is dealing with stuff that is just beyond our ability to grasp. You might be able to get close. But in the end, when you're talking about holy mystery, it's a mystery. And this parable begins, the kingdom of heaven is like. We're talking about the kingdom of heaven. And so, instead of saying, this is what the kingdom of heaven is, he tells us a story. And in this story, it appears that God is a fool. And in this story, it appears that some people feel like they're being cheated. People who work all day feel like they're being cheated. Even though the master said, look, I gave you exactly what I said I'd give you. And so it comes to, it gets to the place where we have to deal with the reality that, and I know this sounds really stupid for me to say this because it just seems so obvious, but sometimes we need to hear it. God's ways are different than our ways. And here Jesus is telling a parable that's essentially about the economy, how we deal with economic things. And the human economy, we all have a pretty good sense of how it works. We go to work, we earn our income, we have to balance our budgets. If we have a fair amount of money, we can do pretty much what we want. If we don't have very much money at all, we have to watch it very carefully. And that's the human economy. But the parable also suggests that God has a different approach to economy. And the only thing that matters in God's economy is if we show up. If we show up. The guy goes out and looking for more people to work the field. It's 5 o'clock in the evening. He's still out looking. And people who show up find their place. And in the end, get paid every bit as much as the people who have been there since 6 o'clock in the morning. That's a different way of dealing with the economy. God's economy is different than our economy. We order our economic life around a set of principles that determine how we acquire wealth and resources. God's economy, the kingdom of heaven, is like a God who just wants us to show up. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. This God sounds like a fool. Does it need to do this? It does. And so getting to that third question, if this is what the parable is telling us about God, that God is extravagant and generous, and God's economy is about enfolding all those who show up, and our economy is about rewarding those who work the hardest and acquire the most. The question is, what difference does all this make? It becomes a real challenge for us. Because the reality is that we live and work in this world. We do. And we have to live and work with this world's rules and regulations. And if we thumb our nose at this world's rules and regulations, we lose. And we all know that. And I believe God knows that. Whether it's fair or not, it's the way it is. So we have to live our life in some way that is faithful to the processes of our temporal human economy. And if we don't, we're in trouble. I think we all understand that. And yet, God's economy The vision that God wishes us to embrace of the kingdom of heaven is nothing like that. It is radically generous, radically gracious, and it doesn't make any difference if we only work an hour or we work all day. Open our hearts, show up, we're in. I was listening to, earlier today, I got called to the hospital, so I went to go see somebody. And on the way over there, I was listening to This American Life on the radio. And the story they had was perfect for what I wanted to talk about tonight. It's about Julian Koenig. He was, in the 1960s, considered the most gifted and talented advertising man in America. And they listed all the different things that, in the 60s that he came up with. Advertising jingles, advertising this, advertising that. And he was the guy who gave us Earth Day. And he used a lot of his skills for charities, but he was 88 when they were playing this. He just died recently, so they played this back. And in his conversations with his daughter and son, he said, if he had his life to live over again, he would do something worthwhile. And then he said, the thought of entering in the world to come, after living my entire life trying to trick people into buying stuff, is such a burden to himself. Here's a man who made the human temporal economy work. And he felt empty about it. And here is a man who was thoughtful enough about his eternal destiny to ponder it. He told his son, all I did when I go to work was to write sentences to trick people into buying something they didn't want. I wasted my talent. And yet, all this other stuff he did, volunteer-wise. But it's that whole sense that the economy of God helps shape in us what is truly important. And that's what I think Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like. This God who is a fool. He pays a person who only works 1 hour the same he pays a person who works 2 hours. And God's economy can then shape what's important to us. And I felt so sad listening to this voice of this man who's very old and is reflecting on his life and basically confess on public radio for anybody who listens that he threw his life away. And yet he's one of the most successful advertising men, made gobs of money, was famous, got asked by presidents and candidates to run their campaign commercials. Because he was so wedded to the human economy. We have to live in the human economy. But our faith teaches us that God holds out for us an eternal destiny is unlike anything you and I can imagine. And the wonder of that can shape how we live in this economy. How we hand our life over. Know that you are loved in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.